Hey guys, tonight we're heading to a place where the wind talks louder than people, where the grass stretches further than your eyes can follow, and where even your hat has something to say about your soul. You're waking up somewhere on the Mongolian steppe, sometime in the 17th century, or was it the 13th? Honestly, your sense of time feels a bit fuzzy after sleeping under yak wool blankets and listening to horses snorting outside all night. You're inside a ger, a Mongolian felt tent that smells faintly of milk smoke and damp wool. The light seeps in through a hole at the top, and it's got that gray-blue tone that always comes just before sunrise. It's cold. Not grab a sweater cold, but why is the air biting me kind of cold? You wriggle deeper into the furs, but realize it's time to rise. Your host is already up stoking the fire, with dry dung casually humming a throat song that somehow sounds like two people at once. Next to you, folded neatly, lies your hat. Not just any hat. This is your luvuz, a tall, rounded creation made from thick felt and stiffened with horsehair. The top rises into a soft peak with a little tuft of black silk sprouting like a proud feather. Its edges are lined with red embroidery, nothing flashy, but definitely a notch above common. You reach for it instinctively. Because out here, before you even greet the world with your voice, you greet it with your hat. Sliding it on, you feel a subtle shift. Warmer, yes, but also more complete. Because in this land, hats aren't just weather protection. They're a quiet language. They tell others who you are, how far you've ridden, and whether you've earned your tea with age or merely charm. You shuffle toward the doorway, ducking your head. The door flap creaks open, and cold air rushes in like a scolding ant. Outside, the world is awake. Smoke coils lazily from neighboring tents, horses whinny, and someone's already milking a goat, with the steady patience of someone who's done it 1,000 mornings before. Your host turns and nods, not at you, but at your hat, a sign of approval, maybe even respect. And here's where things get oddly specific. If you had worn a brim folded the wrong way, or if the silk tuft was red instead of black, he might have looked twice. If your hat were too tall for your status, or worse, too low, you'd be committing an etiquette blunder so subtle, yet so offensive, that you might be offered only water, not milk. Because here, everything matters. Your hat's slope its seams, its wear and tear, even whether it leans slightly to the left or right. Mongolian culture, deeply shaped by hierarchy and harmony with nature, has a long tradition of encoding social meaning into visual symbols. Hats are one of the loudest silent markers. And yes, people have been known to duel over hats. Historians still argue whether the earliest luvuz hats date back to the era of Genghis Khan himself, or whether they evolved later as part of the Oirat and Khalkha fashion distinctions. What they do agree on is that by the 1600s, Mongolian hats had become both highly practical and highly symbolic, like a cross between a weather report and a resume. You step away from the tent. Your boots crunch against frost. The sun is now peeking over the hills, and you notice something peculiar. Every man outside is wearing his hat, but no two hats are exactly the same. One is squat and dark, its edges singed slightly, perhaps from a careless moment near the cooking pot. Another is white and pristine, its shape stiff as a soldier's back. That one might belong to a noble, or at least someone trying very hard to look like one. Children dart between the tents hatless, but a girl of about 12 wears a tiny felt cap tied under her chin with blue ribbon. Her braid flaps as she runs, laughing. Even her ribbon color signals something, perhaps the region she's from, or that she's recently passed a local coming-of-age ceremony. You make a mental note never to underestimate ribbons again. One of the herders waves you over to join him for morning tea. You hesitate, then remember the unspoken rule. Never enter another person's ger without your hat on, unless you're prepared to stay a while or declare deep friendship. So you keep it on. Smart choice. Inside you sip from a steaming bowl of salted milk tea, and the conversation drifts light and warm. The older man sitting beside you nudges your shoulder, nodding at your hat. New, he asks in accented Mongolian. You admit it is. Horsehair, he continues. You nod. He nods back. Good. Honest. And that's the highest compliment you'll hear all day. Out here in the openness of the steppe, there are few walls, no locked doors, and privacy is more concept than reality. So people learn to read one another without words. A dusty hat might mean you've traveled far. A clean one might mean you've stayed too close to comfort. A well-kept peak shows respect for tradition. A drooping one may indicate mourning or poor craftsmanship. And while you may not die for choosing the wrong headwear, you probably won't survive the gossip. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is. I'm always curious who's nodding off in Minnesota and who's just waking up in Manila. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle away from the warmth of the ger, feeling the stiff wool of your cloak shift as you walk. The morning air is crisp, but not unpleasant, tinged with the scent of burning dung and steaming milk. Your breath comes out in little clouds like quiet smoke, signals to the horizon. A few other figures are up, going about their routines, feeding animals, brushing coats, repairing tack. But you're here to study hats. And luckily today is a good day for that. You've been invited to a small gathering. Nothing formal, just a few neighbors meeting at the central tent for tea and idle boasting. But as you approach, you notice something immediately: the hats. There's a man leaning against a saddle rack, tall and thin, with a luvu's hat that gleams faintly. Its tip curves slightly to the left, and the base is wrapped in a thin strip of indigo-dyed silk. That curve. It's not just decorative. It subtly signals that he's from the western provinces and possibly descended from a line of caravan leaders. Another man nearby wears a low, dark red cap flattened like a mushroom, the peak stitched tightly. That shape suggests humility or perhaps simply old age. Some say flatter hats are favored by the elderly to avoid appearing boastful. Others argue they were originally made to better fit under thick winter hoods. Scholars are still bickering about that one. Then there's a woman in a soft camel felt hat, tied delicately beneath her chin. It looks simple, but the stitching is immaculate. You notice the edge bears a double line of crosshatch embroidery. That pattern's not random, it's a regional design from the Khenti Mountains, often sewn by women in the summer months when the sheep shearing is done. If she's wearing it now, it likely means she made it herself. and she's quietly proud of that. As you approach the tent, the host greets you with a nod and a gesture to enter. Gesture to, but before stepping inside, you pause. There's a question. Should you remove your hat? You think back to earlier that morning when your host had left his own hat on during tea, but now you're not sure. Mongolian etiquette is full of subtle variables: your age, their age, your relationship, the occasion, even what is being served. And the answer today hinges on a fermented detail. Tea is not the only drink here. This morning, a woman walks past you carrying a leather sack filled with air fermented mares, milk tart, and slightly fizzy. It sloshes as she walks, and you remember something one of the elders said the night before: keep your hat on when drinking the milk of a fast horse. The logic, well, it might be poetic, or maybe just sanitary. You step inside, hat still on, and settle down on a low felt mat. Around you, other guests sip arag from shallow bowls, hats firmly in place. It's not a hard rule. Some older men remove theirs. But in general, keeping your head covered during casual gatherings is both respectful and practical. After all, the ceiling's low and the wind sneaks through seams. The conversation flows in soft bursts, mostly about horses' pasture rotation, and whose cousin is about to marry a saddlemaker's daughter. But the hats, they keep catching your eye. One man's brim is unusually wide, so wide, in fact, that it occasionally bops his neighbor. That might mean he's trying to make a statement, or maybe he just has a very large head. Either way, his neighbor looks annoyed. At one point, a young boy enters and kneels at the door, nervously clutching a small object in his hands. It's a fur cap too small for an adult, but finely made with a strip of dyed foxtail at the crown. The host smiles and gestures for the boy to rise. First hat, he says to you with a grin. His first. Everyone nods. You get it now. The giving of a first hat in Mongolian culture is a quiet rite of passage. No trumpets, no grand declarations. Just a boy, a gift, and a room full of approving nods. The foxtail is significant. It implies speed, cleverness, and perhaps a dash of luck. Some believe fox-tailed hats were once reserved for messengers who had to cross the steppe by moonlight, relying more on instinct than path. And the boy, he bows, ties the hat under his chin, and sits without a word. But the way his back straightens, the way his eyes scan the room, you can see it. He feels taller. This small ceremony also reveals something else. Hats are often the first, and sometimes only, family heirlooms passed down. A good hat, especially one made of tightly twisted horsehair, or felt pressed under a heavy stone can, outlives several owners. Some hats have been known to last generations, acquiring a patina of oil dust and stories along the way. You glance back at your own hat. Suddenly, it feels heavier. The conversation continues. Someone jokes that a man's hat is the only thing that listens to him more than his horse. Laughter rolls around the room. But there's a truth in that joke. In a place where words are precious and silence is comfort, clothing becomes a language, and hats speak the loudest. Outside, the sun has risen fully now. You catch a glimpse of a rider trotting past his hat, tied tightly with leather cords, a narrow brim flapping behind. It's dusty and dented, but unmistakably dignified. His hat's peak is stitched with blue thread, perhaps a memory of a lost brother, or just a favorite color. Historians still debate the use of color as code. Was it tribal spiritual, a form of silent poetry? Whatever the answer, you start to notice hats. Here are never just hats. They're stories, quiet declarations, shields against wind and ego alike. And as you rise to leave the tent, someone taps your shoulder gently. It's the elder from earlier. You wear it well, he says, motioning to your head. You smile, adjusting the brim slightly, hoping it doesn't lean too far to the left unless that's a compliment today. You step out into the midday sun, blinking as the brightness hits your eyes like a slap from a particularly cheerful cloud. The wind has picked up a bit, nothing dramatic, just enough to lift a few strands of mane from the grazing horses and tug gently at the brim of your hat. You steady it without thinking. Because now you know a hat out of place isn't just inconvenient, it's improper, or worse, confusing. A boy jogs past barefoot, clutching a goat's lead rope in one hand and a piece of flatbread in the other. He doesn't wear a hat yet, just a sweat-slicked bowl cut and a wide grin. But his grandmother, who follows behind at a steadier pace, is fully adorned. Her hat is flat-topped and banded with pale green felt. A long silk tie hangs down one side, swaying like a lazy pendulum. She sees you watching and smiles. Then she does something odd. She tugs her hat forward just a fraction and looks away. A signal. Later, when you're helping ladle soup into wooden bowls at a communal fire, someone explains the gesture. A woman adjusting her hat forward in your presence means I acknowledge your presence, but am too old to flirt. Pulling it back slightly would have meant the opposite. Now you're not sure whether to feel flattered or dismissed. Either way, your hat remains neutral, resting calmly on your head, like a diplomat avoiding scandal. You sit down beside the fire, soup warming your hands, and start to truly consider the implications of what's on your head. Not just the materials, the felt, the stitched lining, the symbolic color, but how it moves, where it points when it comes off. Because this is the tricky bit. Mongolian hat etiquette isn't fixed. It breathes. Context matters. Location, too. For instance, if you were visiting a Buddhist monastery, wearing your hat indoors might be disrespectful or not, depending on whether it's a layman's prayer day, a festival, or simply windy enough to forgive etiquette. Back in the 17th century, as Buddhist influence deepened across the Mongolian plateau, temples introduced more rigid expectations about hat wearing within sacred spaces. You're told a story between spoonfuls of soup about a visiting herdsman who wandered into a prayer chamber without removing his hat. The monks didn't scold him, at least not immediately. Instead, one of them politely offered to bless his headwear. The message was clear. Monks themselves wore head coverings, at times often small caps symbolic of their order or region. But for visitors entering a sacred space, bareheaded often showed humility, vulnerability, and readiness to receive teachings. Except, of course, during outdoor ceremonies. Then all bets were off, especially if snow was involved. There's a moment in the conversation when someone mentions the term Zachzil, loosely translated as edge etiquette. It refers to the social rules practiced at the borders of communities, like how to greet when crossing territories, how to behave when dining with strangers, or how to position one's hat during an apology. Yes, you heard that right. There's a hat posture for saying sorry. You lean forward curious, someone demonstrates. During an apology, you tilt the brim slightly, downward, eyes lowered, and hold the hat lightly with one hand at the side of your head, not on top, not removed. Removed is too dramatic. It suggests self-punishment. But the side hold, that's regretful yet dignified, especially if paired with a bowed head and the phrase, "Ushlarai," I'm sorry. You glance around the fire. Suddenly it all clicks. No wonder no one just flops down or tosses their hat aside. The way people handle their hats here is a kind of body language, quiet, graceful, and deeply ingrained. Someone pulls out a small pouch and offers you dried curds, hard little nuggets that taste somewhere between chalk and very old cheese. You accept, chewing slowly, and hear another story. This one involves a shaman, a misplaced hat, and a very confused goat. Apparently, during a spring ceremony decades ago, a traveling shaman accidentally left his hat on the ritual altar overnight. The next morning, the goat, slated for symbolic release, refused to leave the circle. It kept sniffing the hat and bleating. The villagers took this as a sign the hat had absorbed some of the spirit meant for the goat. They canceled the ritual and spent the rest of the week repurifying everything, including the goat. Now, do modern Mongolians believe that story? Hard to say. But someone swears the hat is still kept in a shrine somewhere near the Orkhon River, encased in glass, and revered as the listening hat. This brings up another unexpected function of hats as spiritual conduits. While not universal, some traditions view headwear as protective not just against weather, but against spirits. There's a belief that wearing a hat while sleeping can shield your dreams from wandering ghosts. Though admittedly, it might just be an excellent excuse to keep your head warm. You laugh quietly at the thought of ghost-proof pajamas. But then someone across the fire nods and says, "That's why babies wear hats before they speak." You raise your eyebrows. "To keep their thoughts safe," the woman says, "before they learn to protect them on their own." You sit in silence for a moment, letting that one float. Then someone announces that the Lama is arriving soon for a midday blessing, and anyone who wishes to receive it should prepare. The group begins to rise and brush themselves off. You're not sure what a prepare means, but one thing is certain. You're not taking off your hat just yet. Instead, you follow the others toward a small stone circle at the edge of camp, where a faded prayer flag flaps lazily in the breeze. The Lama is already there, seated cross-legged on a low stool, back straight as an arrow. His own hat is minimal, a soft cap almost like a skull cap in saffron yellow. He doesn't look up as people arrive, but you feel his attention anyway, like warmth from a sun you're not facing. One by one, visitors kneel or bow. Most keep their hats on, but subtly shift them. Brims slightly tilted upward, revealing the eyes. An act of openness, willingness. You mimic them, hoping it's the right move. When it's your turn, the Lama finally looks up. His eyes are sharp and oddly kind. You kneel. Your hat stays put, but just barely. A breeze catches the edge, and you place one hand gently against it, holding it steady. He notices, nods, and just like that, you're blessed. You rise, bow once more, and step back, heart beating a little faster. Your hat still on your head somehow feels heavier than before. You wander back from the blessing site with your hand still brushing the edge of your hat, half expecting it to hum or glow or whisper something sage and mysterious. It doesn't. But somehow the air around your head feels different. Maybe it's the breeze. Maybe it's the quiet thrill of surviving your first spiritual encounter without committing a major hat offense. You pass a cluster of camels, chewing with the apathy of creatures that have seen every version of human awkwardness. One snorts in your direction. You nod respectfully. There are hat rules for that too. Well, not exactly, but you wouldn't be surprised. Back near the central camp, a group is gathering for what looks like preparation for a long ride. Horses are being saddled, supplies tied in neat bundles. One man, tall and imposing, adjusts his hat with precision. It's slightly shorter than yours, but its shape is unmistakably that of a rider, tapered at the sides, snug at the crown, with no frills or dangling parts that might flap in the wind. You ask a young herder beside you, what makes a good riding hat? Doesn't fight the wind. He replies, matter of fact. Makes sense. On the steppe, you learn quickly that wind isn't just a force of nature. It's practically a character in daily life. Your hat needs to cooperate with it, not challenge it to a duel. That's why most traditional Mongolian riding hats are narrow-fitted and often made with a band of horsehair stitched tightly at the base, giving it just enough weight to cling close without needing a strap. You're invited to join the caravan for a short ride to a neighboring settlement. It's not far, only a few hours' journey, but enough to test the loyalty of your hat. You mount a sturdy gray horse and settle in hat firmly in place. The riders around you form a loose flowing line, their silhouettes rising and falling like slow waves. The rhythm of hooves, the flutter of fabric, the hiss of grass giving way underfoot. You notice that as you ride, the hats ahead of you tilt at slight angles, some perfectly forward, others tilted left or right. Not an accident. There's a rumor, which may or may not be true, that seasoned riders develop their own hat signature over time. A tilt to the left might indicate a preference for Western routes, right for Eastern. Some believe it even communicates political leanings from centuries past. Historians still debate whether this subtle tilt code was intentional or just romantic nonsense invented by poets. But out here where silence rides beside you, the theory doesn't feel so far-fetched. You try tilting your own hat slightly to the left. Immediately, the rider beside you glances over, then smiles without a word. Message received, or maybe he just thought your hat slipped. Either way, you feel oddly smug. As the caravan winds through a low pass, you become aware of another curious feature. The hats seem to echo the land. The higher the terrain, the taller the hats. Whether that's symbolic or just coincidental is up for debate. But some believe early nomads adopted tall hat peaks to mimic the sacred mountains around them, visual prayers worn proudly. It's also theorized that these exaggerated shapes helped distinguish figures from afar. You could tell a noble from a distance, or a monk or a messenger, simply by the silhouette of their headgear. Out here, where smoke signals get swallowed by the wind, the shape of a hat could be a vital form of long-distance communication. As you crest a rise and look down at the valley below, you spot your destination. Another scattering of gyrs, a few herds, and the telltale glint of sunlight off polished felt. Even from here, the residents' hats signal their presence before you hear a single word. The ride ends in front of a large communal ger, and as you dismount, your thighs ache and your hat is slightly askew. You adjust it discreetly. Inside, the local elder greets your group and gestures for everyone to sit. A new round of salted tea appears seriously. You're starting to think, this place runs on 90% tea and 10% horse logic. During the rest period, someone tells a tale from centuries past about a general in the Mongol army who won battles not with swords, but with his hat. According to legend, this general wore a uniquely shaped headpiece tall, with 4 feathered corners. His enemies mistook him for a divine figure and fled before a single arrow was loosed. Is it true? Probably not. But the same story appears, oddly enough, in Persian manuscripts from the 14th century in a Chinese trader's travel diary. In both cases, the foreign observers note Mongol headwear as formidable and imperial in tone. One even described the hats as thunderclouds with eyes beneath, poetic and a little terrifying. One theory holds that these flamboyant styles were deliberately cultivated during the empire's expansion, visual propaganda worn at eye level. Instead of golden crowns, Mongol leaders had towering fur and felt creations that screamed both mysticism and muscle. As you rest, you look around and notice a few practical details. Many riders are airing out their hats, propping them on wooden stands beside the fire. Not the ground, of course, never the ground. Placing a hat on the earth is a bit like dropping a holy book in the mud. It's not just impolite, it's unlucky. Instead, you're shown how to balance your hat upright on a folded cloth peak facing east if you're feeling especially careful. East is the direction of the sun's rise, of clarity and renewal. Some folks do it out of habit. Others, because their grandmother would yell at them otherwise. You copy the gesture. Your hat wobbles, then settles. Peak east. You exhale. Someone next to you chuckles. Your hat has learned its manners. And just then you realize something. You've been wearing the same hat since dawn. You've ridden across a valley, received a blessing, nearly lost it to the wind, and used it possibly to flirt, apologize, and signal geographic preference. All without saying more than a dozen words. That's no mere accessory. That's a language. And tomorrow you'll learn what happens when that language gets misused. The next morning begins innocently enough. You wake to the familiar scent of pine smoke and yak butter tea, your back gently protesting against the firm mat beneath you. The air is cooler than yesterday, laced with the crisp bite that warns of coming weather. You reach for your hat. It rests exactly where you left it, carefully balanced on its folded cloth facing east. But as you slip it on, something feels off. It takes you a moment to notice the peak is slightly more upright than you remember. At first, you think you're imagining it, but then a quiet voice in the back of your mind whispers, "That's not how you left it." You shrug, assuming it shifted in the night. What you don't know yet is that today, your slightly too tall hat will almost get you kicked out of a blessing ceremony. It begins with a visit to a local monastery, a low, broad structure built of stone and timber ringed by prayer flags, fluttering like sleepy butterflies. You're traveling there with your host and 2 other families to receive a seasonal blessing from the head lama, a respected teacher known for his stern gaze. and generous portions of sampa roasted barley flour. The mood is calm. Children walk in quiet lines. Adults murmur greetings. Your host leans in as you approach the temple steps. Keep your hat on until the door, he says. Then decide. That's not helpful. You step inside, ducking under the lintel, and immediately feel the hush fall over you like a soft blanket. The room is dim, glowing from yak butter lamps, and filled with the scent of juniper and warm cloth. Robed monks line the walls, seated cross-legged, their shaved heads bobbing slightly as they chant. Everyone's hat is either off entirely or hanging lightly from a wrist. You reach for yours and freeze. Because one of the junior monks, barely older than a teenager, is now staring directly at you. His eyes flick to your hat, then back to you. And then you swear he smirks. You panic a little. What did you do wrong? Is the hat too upright, too wide? Is it touching your ears in a way that screams novice goat herder instead of humble guest? You pull it off in a hurry, bowing slightly, and clutch it to your chest. The moment passes. The monk turns away. But later, during the tea, doi offering, your host leans over. You're lucky, he whispers. Your hat's peak is close to a ceremonial style. Tall peaks are for clergy, especially here. You blink. Apparently that slight tilt, barely noticeable to your outsider's eyes, could have been read as arrogance. A guest entering a sacred space looking like he outranks the monk's bad form. Very bad form. You take a breath. Okay, lesson learned. But this isn't a one-time slip. There's a whole history of hat hierarchy in Mongolian religious life, and the rules, though rarely written, are very real. During the rise of Tibetan Buddhism in the 16th and 17th centuries, Mongolian clergy adopted distinct hats to signal not only rank, but also specific doctrinal alignments. Some hats were tall and fan-shaped, symbolizing wisdom, radiating in all directions. Others were low and layered, meant to resemble the folds of the lotus. Lay people, meanwhile, were expected to keep their hats simple during ceremonies. Low brim, rounded crown, no frills. Anything elaborate was reserved for those who had trained for decades to wear them. You glance down at your own hat, now resting quietly in your lap like an embarrassed dog. Outside the temple, after the blessing, you find yourself walking beside an older man who wears a squat, faded cap. It's plain, no colored threading, no silk tuft. You ask him how long he's had it. He shrugs. Since before my second wife, he says. Good hat. You ask if he ever wore one like yours. He laughs. Once? For a wedding. Wrong color. Her uncle said I looked like a prince with no kingdom. You both laugh. But again, lesson absorbed. In Mongolian culture, hats aren't just accessories. They're semi-public declarations. And wearing the wrong one at the wrong time is less about fashion and more about function and humility. Back at camp, you're greeted by another surprise. A young man, perhaps 17, is standing awkwardly beside the fire, holding out a small, decorative hat in both hands. The crown is peaked with red stitching, and the inside is lined with soft goat hide. He glances at you, then at your host. He wants to trade. Your host explains. Says, your hat is lucky. You look down. Your slightly tall, almost blasphemous hat, lucky. Apparently, the young man's brother just had a successful herding season after borrowing your host's hat for a week. Word got around. Now you, the foreign guest with the unpredictable headwear, are a minor local curiosity. You consider. Declining might be rude. Accepting would mean giving up your trusted companion and its warm, wind-blocking familiarity. But etiquette here is fluid. Trading hats can be symbolic. It means trust, kinship, even shared fate. And so after a moment's pause, you remove your hat slowly and offer it with both hands. He accepts it like it's made of silver. In exchange, you receive the red stitched goat hair hat, smaller, lighter, and somehow sharper. It smells faintly of pine and beeswax. You place it on your head and feel different, not worse, just new. You ask your host what this gesture means. He smiles. Now you're tied to his herds. If he has a good season, you'll be remembered. If not, he trails off. You nod. Understood. Later that evening, as you sit beside the fire, you look around and notice something unexpected. Nearly every adult in the circle has at some point adjusted, offered, removed, or repositioned their hat since you sat down. And every movement carries meaning. A man tilts his hat back, slightly boredom. A woman loops hers around her wrist, intimacy. A child mimics an elder's hat posture, learning. And it occurs to you this isn't just etiquette, it's theater. Subtle, slow, and silent, but theater nonetheless. An unspoken ballet of felt and horsehair dancing across time and tea bowls. You lean back, letting your new hat settle into place. The wind picks up, tugging lightly at the brim, but it holds. It fits. And now, at least for tonight, so do you. The next day arrives with the soft patter of hooves and the distant coughing of a camel that sounds frankly like it smokes too much. You yawn, rub your face, and instinctively reach for your hat. Except it's not where you left it. Your heart does a little hiccup. You scan the room. No hat on the peg, no hat on your bedroll, no hat beside your boots. For a moment you consider the absurd. Has it walked off on its own? Then you hear laughter. Outside, a trio of children is gathered near the tethered horses, and one of them, yes, that one has your hat perched lopsidedly on her head, like a crown made of trouble. She waves when she sees you and bolts. The others follow. You sigh. The hat chases on. You stumble out into the sunlight half-dressed and barefoot as the children shriek and scatter like delighted sparrows. Your hat flaps comically as it's passed from head to head. Each kid doing their best impression of an elder. Hunched shoulders, solemn nods, the occasional exaggerated throat clearing. Finally, they drop the act and collapse in a heap of giggles, tossing your hat gently into your arms. You can't help but laugh too, though not without a bit of relief. This hat, now yours for less than a day, already feels oddly indispensable. As you dust it off, a woman nearby watches the scene with amusement. She offers you a bowl of bortsog, deep-fried dough knots still warm, and gestures for you to sit. You've just been tested, she says, not unkindly. Tested, you ask, chewing. She nods. They do that with guests. See how they react. If you yell, they'll say your hat brings sharp wind. If you laugh, they'll say your hat brings soft rain. You glance down at the red stitched goat hair crown. So what does that make me, umbrella? She grins. That morning over dough and milk tea, you learn about the riding hats of the steppes, those crafted not for ceremony or flirtation, but for long journeys through wind grit and sudden downpours. These hats aren't delicate. They're not showpieces. They're hardened by wind, soaked by storms, and matted with salt from countless hours in the saddle. Some have stitched in flaps for ear coverage. Others small hidden pockets tucked in the lining, just large enough for a coin, a pressed herb, or a tiny prayer scroll. You meet one such hat up close later that day. A caravan arrives, 5 riders' cloaks, flapping behind them like banners. One dismounts near the fire and removes his hat with a flourish. It's sun-bleached and misshapen, its peak barely hanging on its rim, scorched and stitched with what looks suspiciously like thread dyed with soot. You stare. He catches your eye and nods at your new hat. Trade. Everyone laughs. He grins, then explains. His hat is over 10 years old, and though it looks like it lost a fight with a cooking pot, it's been through everything. Dust storms in the Gobi River crossings, even a thunderstorm that he claims nearly electrified it. You politely decline the trade, but listen closely as he tells a tale, half true, half says showmanship, about a time he used the hat to block an arrow. Not metaphorically, an actual arrow. He holds it up, pointing to a tear just above the brim. You lean closer. Sure enough, there's a neat hole, patched but unmistakable. He shrugs. Wasn't aiming for me, he says. But still, I thank the hat anyway. Is it true? Probably not. But it leads into a fascinating discussion around the fire about whether riding hats served as proto-helmets. Some scholars argue that hardened felt, when layered properly, could deflect a glancing blow. And while they weren't military gear per se, there's ample evidence that some warriors reinforced their hats with thin strips of leather or bone for light protection. The line between clothing and armor, it seems, was often blurred. And speaking of blurred lines, the boundary between function and belief is also hazy when it comes to hats. Some riders whisper that a well-worn hat can remember the road, that if you get lost placing it on the ground and walking a circle around, it might help you find your way back. Is it a superstition? A psychological trick? Or just an excuse to rest for a minute and think clearly? No one knows, but no one laughs either. Later that afternoon, as the sun arcs lazily toward the horizon, you take your first proper solo ride across the steppe. Just you, a chestnut mare with a bit of sass, and the wind constant, curious, and mildly judgmental. You tie your new hat securely under your chin and ride. And oh, it works. It doesn't flap, it doesn't spin. It doesn't get pulled sideways like your first one. Instead, it seems to slice through the wind, anchored by its design and maybe, just maybe, by something more. You ride until the hills blur into golden folds, until the shadows stretch long and soft, until the mare slows without your asking, as if she too knows the day is ending. When you return to camp, someone claps you on the back. Good hat, they say. And now you realize they're not just talking about stitching. They're saying, you held on. You moved with the wind. You didn't lose yourself. You tip your hat in reply. And that night, for the first time since you arrived, you hang it on your own peg just outside the door. Peak facing east brim, clean memories inside. Tomorrow maybe you'll try tilting it slightly, just to see who notices. You wake before the sun, stirred by the sound of soup sloshing in a pot, and the comforting scrape of a ladle against a copper bottom. The sky outside the gare is still a deep ink blue. Inside, someone's already moving around with the silent efficiency of those who've done the same morning routine since before you were born. Your hat waits for you by the door just as you left it. But today, before you reach for it, your host gestures toward a small wooden peg on the wall near the fire. Use the peg, he says, never the ground. You nod, though this isn't the first time you've heard the warning. The idea of placing a hat on the floor has come up again and again, always with the same firm shake of the head. It's not just about cleanliness, it's about respect, about energy, about order. In Mongolian culture, the hat peg, a simple carved sliver of wood, is more than a place to hang your headwear. It's a quiet monument to hierarchy, intention, and cosmic tidiness. You reach up and carefully settle your hat onto the peg, watching how it balances there. The peg itself is worn smooth, the wood darkened from years of smoke and fingertips. You realize it's not nailed in place. It's lashed to the lattice wall with a strip of leather so it can be moved or removed if needed. Who gets a peg, you ask. Your host raises an eyebrow, as if the answer should be obvious. The ones who earn one. Turns out not every guest is granted a peg. Sometimes hats are left outside. Sometimes they're hung on saddle horns. But a true peg inside the home near the fire, upright and safe, is a symbol. It means trust. It means place. In some families, children aren't given a peg until they herd their first solo flock. In others, it's awarded after a wedding, or when the old peg holder dies and their place is passed down. You glance at your own temporary peg. Is it yours or borrowed? You don't ask. Later that morning, you join the rest of the camp for breakfast, milky porridge, chewy bread, and the ever-present tea. You notice that everyone has either hung or placed their hat properly. Not one is on the floor. Even the smallest child has looped a cloth over a low rung of the wall and placed a toy hat on top, a mimic peg. While you eat, the conversation drifts toward the politics of hat placement, a topic you wouldn't have believed was real until now. Apparently, where you put your hat tells others not just about your personality, but your current emotional state, alliances, and even your ambitions. A hat placed too close to the fire, risky, shows you crave attention or that you're careless with tradition. A hat hung too far from the door, distant, you might be avoiding someone or hiding shame. A hat hung right beside another person's, especially someone older or of higher status, without permission. That's a challenge, an unspoken dare. Once someone says a man hung his hat next to the Khan's guest peg. He wasn't invited back. The whole group chuckles. Another woman adds, "But my grandmother used to say, if you want to marry into a family, hang your hat near their mother's and pretend you don't notice." More laughter. The topic turns to a local story, possibly true, possibly just good storytelling, about a marriage that began because two young lovers kept swapping hat pegs each morning before anyone else woke up. It was months before the camp elders noticed, and by then the hats were already seen as entwined. You sip your tea and wonder if your peg means something you haven't quite earned yet. After breakfast, a neighbor arrives, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a wide-brimmed hat made of dark brown felt. She glances at your peg, then at you, then at your host. You gave him the inside peg, she asks. Your host just shrugs. He hasn't put it on the floor yet. Apparently, that's all the qualification needed for now. The woman softens. She removes her own hat with a fluid motion and carefully sets it on a peg beside yours. The same height, the same distance from the fire, equal. The gesture feels enormous. You find yourself watching the hats more closely throughout the day. How they tilt on their pegs. How some lean into each other like old friends. How others hang alone, stiff and straight, like silent sentinels. There's a rhythm to it, almost architectural. Each peg a column, each had a roof, each arrangement, a quiet blueprint of how the household works. That evening, you're invited to help prepare a small feast, just dried meats, root vegetables, and some preserved berries pulled from a jar that smells suspiciously alcoholic. While chopping onions badly, you ask one of the elders if they ever had their hat peg taken away. He pauses, knife hovering. Yes, he says, once. You wait. I accused my brother of stealing a horse. I was wrong. My father removed this peg. For how long? He shrugs. A season. I slept with my hat. You don't laugh. Neither does he. But after a moment he adds, he gave it back after I made peace. With my brother. And the horse. You decide not to ask what happened to the horse. Later, as the fire crackles and a light wind begins to whistle through the seams of the gear, everyone retires for the night. One by one, hats are lifted, dusted, adjusted, and placed with gentle care on their pegs. Some are covered with cloth. Others left open to the air. You hesitate for a moment before hanging yours. Then, with a deliberate motion, you raise your red-stitched goat hair hat and place it on the peg. Just so. Not too high, not too low. Aligned, balanced, steady. And somehow that small act feels like lighting a candle. Not just an end-of-day routine, but a way of saying I was here. I respected the house. I belonged. And outside, under the night sky stretched wide, like a blanket of blue-black felt, the wind nods its approval through the canvas walls. The next morning, you wake to the sound of quiet humming and the swish of fabric. Someone is dressing nearby, carefully layering garments for a day of ritual. You stretch, blink, and peer toward the door, where golden light is starting to spill through the canvas flap. It's a special day, your host tells you. A marriage is being negotiated, or perhaps tested is the better word, because before there is talk of dates and dowries, there is the hat glance. You blink, still groggy. The what your host just grins and pours your tea. You'll see. Outside preparations have begun for the matchmaking ritual. Not the big wedding feast. This is earlier, quieter, full of indirect looks and subtle maneuvers. It begins when a suitor, escorted by his uncle or older brother, arrives at the home of a potential bride. Gifts are exchanged, cheesecloth, dried fruit, but what really matters is what sits on the suitor's head, because today his hat does most of the talking. You follow the small procession to the neighboring ger, where the young man in question waits outside, clearly nervous. His hat is tall and stiff, with braided cords hanging neatly down either side of his face. The crown is polished and creased just so, like someone spent the better part of an hour making sure it looked worn, but not too worn. He adjusts it again. Too clean, murmurs someone beside you. Trying too hard. The bride's aunt emerges from the gyre a moment later. She's the designated judge for this round, not of wealth or livestock, but of character. And character, as everyone here seems to believe, leaves traces in your hat. She walks slowly, deliberately, not looking at the young man directly. Instead, she circles him, once eyes flicking over his shoulders, his boots, his hands. And then she pauses in front of him, eyes locking briefly on his hat. What is she looking for? Everything. Dust on the brim could mean he's lazy or a fast rider, depending on where it's settled. Creases near the crown indicates how he handles stress, or how he stores it stuffed in a saddlebag or folded with care. Color fading. Too much sun exposure could mean he's a wanderer, adventurous, but maybe unreliable. Even the scent matters. A hat that smells like horses and wood smoke is expected. One that smells like wet dog or over-fermented airag, less ideal. The aunt frowns. It's hard to read. She leans forward and taps the brim once. A quick, decisive gesture. Everyone holds their breath. Then she turns and walks back into the tent. The suitor exhales. Was that good, you whisper? Your host shrugs. She didn't remove it from his head. That's something. Turns out hat removal by the matchmaker is a major signal. Taking it gently means welcome. Taking it and hanging it inside means almost family. Taking it and handing it back. Rejection, silent, undeniable. But there's more. Later in the day, after negotiations have begun, inside the gyre, the bride herself appears only briefly. She walks past the suitor without speaking, a bundle of herbs in one hand and a small wooden bowl in the other. She never looks directly at him, but she does glance at his hat. Twice. Twice is good, your host whispers. 3 is bad. It means she thinks he's too proud. You begin to realize this isn't romance. This is espionage with felt accessories. You spend the rest of the afternoon watching the other guests. Many of them remove their hats as they step inside the gyre. But one older woman, clearly a respected relative, leaves hers on. Her hat is wide-brimmed, a deep plum color, the edges lined with tiny metal discs that tinkle when she moves. No one questions it. Why does she keep it on, you ask? She buried 2 husbands, someone murmurs. Now she wears her decisions. You don't quite know what that means, but it silences any further questions. As the sun dips lower, and the shadows stretch long across the grass, the outcome of the matchmaking remains uncertain. But as the suitor exits the tent, you notice something important. His hat is missing. Then from behind the curtain, the aunt steps forward, holding it carefully, respectfully, and hangs it on the inner peg near the bride's father's seat. Your host grins. It's done. You sit by the fire that night, watching as the wind toys with the edge of your own hat. You wonder what it says about you, what creases and dust and sweat have made their way into the fabric, weaving your hours and missteps and kindnesses into something readable. Someone passes you a bowl of fermented mare's milk. You drink. It's still terrible, but tonight you're more interested in the man who sits opposite you. He wears a small, tightly folded cap, a herder's hat, no ornamentation. But you notice the edge has been mended twice, and the inner lining is marked with ink, not a signature, but a prayer. He catches your glance and tips the brim toward you. And just like that, something passes between you, silent, genuine, and oddly warm. You've learned that hats are not just about etiquette or even tradition. They are archives, records of who you've been and who others expect you to be. And tomorrow you'll learn what happens when someone wears the wrong hat on purpose. The next morning, the air feels charged. Not stormy, no thunderheads on the horizon, no scent of rain or crackle of distant lightning. Just watchful. Like the wind itself is pausing to listen. You sense it even before breakfast when your host tightens the strap on his felt boots with more force than usual, and when the children play a little more quietly than they did yesterday. Something is different. And it walks straight into camp just after sunrise, riding a dark horse and wearing a hat he shouldn't be. At first glance, the man doesn't seem all that unusual. Broad shoulders, a well-worn deal, a scar across his chin that looks suspiciously like the work of a nervous goat. He nods in greeting, dismounts without a word, and hands his reins to a boy, with the sort of effortless confidence that says, "I've been here before, and I will be here again." But the hat, it's wrong. Beautiful, yes. Immaculate even. Tall, with a flared brim that dips like a falcon's wing, and edged in golden thread. The silk tuft at the peak is imperial red. The side band is stiffened with lacquered felt and embroidered in a pattern only a few families are allowed to wear. And those families, they sit a few rungs higher on the societal ladder. You glance around and see others noticing it too. Eyebrows lift, conversations stall mid-sentence. A wooden spoon pauses halfway to a bowl because this man who no one seems to recognize is wearing a hat reserved for nobility. Now, Mongolian tradition doesn't come with laminated rulebooks. There are no printed diagrams saying this hat equals general, that hat equals goat inspector. But the boundaries are deeply understood, unwritten, and sacred. Hat shapes, colors, creases, they've been developed over generations. And some styles are simply not worn unless you've earned them through birth or blessing. Who is he, you ask your host quietly. Trouble, he says without looking up. The stranger sits by the fire, removing his hat slowly, deliberately, and setting it, oh no, on the ground beside him. You hear a quiet gasp, not from a child, but from the elder with the plum-colored brim, the one who buried 2 husbands and doesn't flinch easily. You now understand this isn't an accident. This man is making a statement. And that statement is, I do not care for your rules. You're told in hushed tones that this kind of thing has happened before. Once, a young herder tried to impress a visiting noblewoman by borrowing his uncle's ceremonial hat. He was caught, and while no one punished him physically, he found himself gently but firmly ignored for an entire season. No invitations, no eye contact. Even the sheep seemed to wander a bit farther from him. Wearing a hat above your station, it turns out, is a kind of theft, not of fabric but of honor. Still, this stranger seems unconcerned. He eats what's offered, drinks what's poured. No one challenges him outright. Not here, not yet. But then he makes one mistake. He enters the central gear without asking. Now there are layers to this. Entering someone's home without permission is rude in any culture. But doing so while wearing the hat of a Khan's envoy and placing it on the floor of the host's family ger, that crosses the line from arrogance into symbolic conquest. Minutes later, the elder yes, the one with the plum hat, rises. She doesn't shout. She doesn't accuse. Instead, she walks slowly to where the stranger's hat rests, lifts it gently, and places it outside on a low stool facing west, the direction of endings, of farewells. That's it. That's the gesture, and it's louder than any word. The man returns moments later and sees it. For the first time, he looks uncertain, but only briefly. He picks up the hat, dusts it off, and without putting it back on, leaves. No confrontation, no duel, no scandal. But as he mounts his horse and rides off, the camp exhales. You sit quietly by the fire that evening, hat in your lap, turning it slowly. You ask your host, what would have happened if the man had refused to leave? He shrugs. We'd have fed him again, until he remembered who he was. You glance up, confused. Hospitality is not weakness, he adds, but we don't forget. Historians still debate whether the Mongol courts in the 17th century ever enforced legal dress codes. Some sources suggest there were edicts passed by minor khans forbidding commoners from wearing silk hats or eagle-feathered brims. Others say it was all social pressure, no written law, just a shared sense of propriety. What's clear, though, is that the power of a hat lies not in its thread count, but in context. A noble's hat on a noble fine. A noble's hat on a humble rider, suspicious. A humble hat worn proudly, respectfully, with the dust of 1,000 honest miles on it. That in many eyes is the most honorable hat of all. You look around the circle that night. So many hats, plain, stained, mended, loved. Each one worn exactly as it should be, not for vanity, but for belonging. And as you place yours on its peg, facing east, with a little more reverence than usual, you realize something. No one asked that man to leave. No one yelled. But a woman with one soft gesture and 1,000 years of custom behind her told him everything he needed to hear. That's hat law. And tomorrow you'll find out what happens when hats fall, not by choice, but by windstorm and mischief. The wind wakes you. Not the gentle kind, not the lazy breeze that tosses your bangs and carries tea steam sideways, but a proper mischievous, whistling steppe gale. It rattles the canvas flaps of your gear, makes the poles creak overhead, and sends dry bits of grass dancing like mischievous spirits across the ground. You sit up and immediately check the peg. Your hat is gone. For a second, panic. You fling aside the curtain and step out into a morning that's half dust and half windsong. And there, about 20 feet from the gear, flipping end over end, like a delighted thief, is your hat. You run, you stumble, you lunge, miss. It tumbles again toward the horses as if drawn by hooves in chaos. Someone laughs behind you. Possibly a child. Possibly the wind itself. By the time you retrieve your runaway headwear wedged dramatically between two dung piles, it's acquired a fresh curve, a few bent threads, and perhaps a bruised ego. You dust it off, shake it twice, and set it back on your head with a quiet sigh. No one saw you hope. You're wrong. As you return to camp, you're met with several smirks. One knowing glance from the plum hat elder, and a soft observation from your host. The wind likes to test those who hang their hats too confidently. You nod, humbled. That day, you learn about the summer switch, an annual ritual across the steppes, when as the winds shift and the sun begins to sting, more than soothe, Mongolian families retire their heavy winter hats and bring out lighter summer ones. Your own hat, though precious, was never meant for the windier months. It's ceremonial, made for visits and fire circles, not galloping or squalls. A neighbor offers you a loner, short-brimmed, made of thin felt, and light enough to forget you're wearing it. There's a narrow blue band sewn around the crown. You ask what it means. "It was my father's," she says. "Every time he fixed a fence, the brim caught more sun." You notice it's not elegant. The stitching is uneven. The crown is slightly tilted. But it has that look of long use. The creases aren't defects, they're history. Throughout the day, others swap their headwear too. One man wears a hat so floppy it might as well be a collapsed pastry. Another opts for a tightly wrapped cloth turban instead of a structured cap, easier to ride in, he explains. Children wear soft, stitched-together scraps of leather dyed in bright vegetable colors. None match, no one cares. But then comes the midday dispute. Two brothers, young, proud, full of opinions, argue about a broken cart wheel. One accuses the other of negligence. The other fires back with something about goats and priorities. Voices rise, and then it happens. One hat falls. Whether knocked off by accident or gesture is unclear. But the younger brother's cap lands in the dirt-brim down crown flattened. Everyone freezes. Because in Mongolian culture, a fallen hat isn't just a wardrobe malfunction. It's a symbolic event. "Is it cursed now?" you whisper. Your host doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he walks over, picks up the hat gently, and brushes it off with 3 slow strokes. Then he places it back on the young man's head, but backwards. The crowd laughs, tension breaks. Apparently, this is an old trick reverse placement to signal you've been foolish. But we forgive you. A backwards hat can mean teasing humility or even temporary penance depending on the angle and situation. The older brother chuckles, pats his sibling's shoulder, and the fight dissolves. But you can't stop thinking about it, how such a simple object carries such weight. Not physically, most of these hats barely register in your hands, but culturally, emotionally. That evening, as the sun sinks low and paints the grasslands in gold and rust, you sit by a small hill, watching riders return from a distant errand. One man's hat has gone lost to the wind, perhaps, but he doesn't seem upset. Maybe it didn't want to come back. Someone jokes nearby. And it's not entirely silly. There's an old belief still whispered among elders that some hats choose their moment to leave. That when they've absorbed enough sweat, heard enough stories, or shielded enough thoughts, they catch the wind and vanish, spiraling off into the dusk like a page being turned. You ask if anyone's ever found one again. Sometimes someone says, but when you do, it won't be yours anymore. Back at the gyre, your loner hat sits patiently by the door. You lift it, feel its warmth from the day, and hold it a little longer than usual before placing it carefully, yes, on the peg, this time extra securely. No more dramatic exits. You glance at your ceremonial hat still drying near the stove and realize something, its shape has changed. The storm has softened it. The crown now leans slightly to the left. A crease runs diagonally across the front. A thread has frayed. And yet, you like it better this way. Because out here, perfection is suspicious. The untouched hat raises eyebrows. The pristine brim hints at inexperience. But a well-traveled, slightly battered, sun-warped piece of felt, that's the mark of someone who's lived. You smile. Tomorrow you'll witness a childhood rite of passage where a boy earns the right to his first real hat. And not by blood, by dung. Yes, really. The next morning, something feels different. It's not the weather, though. The breeze is cool and the sun warm, but the energy. A buzz, a subtle anticipation in the way people move around the camp. You sense it in the way the older children gather together and whisper. In the way a father ties a sash twice around his son's waist instead of once. Even the goats, usually indifferent to all things ceremonial, seem unusually alert. Today is a day of firsts, specifically a child's first hat game. You've heard murmurs about it since your arrival. Part rite of passage, part initiation, part hazing ritual disguised as tradition. And as you sip your salty tea and stretch the sleep from your limbs, your host confirms it with a single raised eyebrow and one word, dung. You blink. Just watch, he says. Later that morning, in the middle of the camp, a small circle has formed. At its center stands a boy, maybe 7 or 8, his face scrubbed, his boots polished, and his head very deliberately bare. This is unusual. Children here often wear simple caps or soft cloth wraps to shield their heads from sun and wind, but not today. Today, the boy's head is exposed not as punishment, but as challenge. Around the ring, several older children stand, each holding their own hat. But the moment is not playful. It's ceremonial. There are rules. Your host leans in, explaining the basics of hat tag, a traditional game that tests awareness, reflexes, and most importantly, grace under embarrassment. The stakes. A first hat of one's own. The boy must dodge, duck, and endure a series of light taps and harmless feints delivered by the other kids' hats, thwacks across the shoulder taps to the knee, and yes, the occasional soft thump on the head. All is in good fun. Until the final round. A hush falls as a girl, no older than 10, steps forward. She wears a mischievous grin and carries not a hat, but a small lump of dried sheep dung, balanced precariously on a flat wooden board. The crowd titters. The boy's eyes widen. You wince. You ask, "Is this serious, symbolic?" Your host replies too quickly. The rule: if the boy flinches, ducks, or protests the final symbolic tap, he must wait another season before receiving his first hat. But if he stands tall and accepts it, dung, and all he's considered ready. The girl steps forward, raises the board, walks a slow circle around him. Everyone holds their breath. Then, with the care of a priest delivering a blessing, she gently presses the dung-dry, harmless, faintly crumbly, against the boy's forehead and says, "Let this be the last dirt that's not yours." A strange phrase, you think, but the reaction is immediate. Cheers erupt, the elder women ululate. Someone tosses a handful of millet into the air. And from behind the crowd, the boy's grandfather steps forward, holding a soft, hand-stitched hat, rounded at the crown, with a tiny tassel made of horse mane. He places it on the boy's head like a crown. And just like that, the boy becomes a wearer. Later, as the festivities wind down and the children begin a new, more chaotic version of the game, this time with no symbolic intent and lots more actual mud, you sit with the grandfather who presented the hat. You ask what the phrase meant. "Let this be the last dirt that's not yours." He smiles, sips his tea, and explains. "It means life will dirty you, Wind work lost time. But the dirt you earn is yours. It teaches, it toughens. But today, that dirt was a gift, not yet earned, not yet yours. It reminds the boy, respect the work ahead. You nod, letting the words settle. He goes on. And besides, he adds, it's funny. Fair point. You start to notice how everyone talks about hats now, not just in terms of fabric or design, but life stage. The unmarried wear narrow-brimmed hats, practical and unassuming. Married men often add bands of red or brown to their crowns. Widows wear deep shades, sometimes with black ribbon, tucked inside, not visible but always there. Children's hats are light and loose. Elders' hats seem to grow heavier with age, as if wisdom has weight. You spot the boy from earlier, walking proudly, adjusting his new hat, every few steps clearly, unsure how to just wear it yet. A few older kids nudge him, laugh, tug gently on the tassel. He grins. He'll grow into it. That evening, as the sky turns amber and sheep calls echo across the hill, your host tells a final story over firelight. Once, many years ago, two boys played the hat game. One flinched at the dung and refused the hat. The other accepted it, smiling the whole time. Decades later, the one who flinched became a trader, wealthy, clever, always clean. The other became a herder, weathered, honest, and beloved. Who lived the better life, you ask? Your host shrugs. The first wore a tall hat. The second never took his off. You think about that long after the fire dies. And as you hang your own hat, no dung necessary, you wonder if your head has changed shape slightly. Not from size, from understanding. Tomorrow you'll share in a storm. Not of weather, but of storytelling, spilled tea, and swirling hats as alliances are tested and friendships forged beneath sudden hail. The storm doesn't announce itself, it just arrives. One moment you're sharing tea under a canvas awning, watching a girl braid her cousin's hair with practiced ease. The next, the wind punches in from the north, hard and sudden, scattering scarves, kicking up dust and flipping a stack of freshly dried meat into the air like a deck of cards. And the hats, oh the hats, don't stand a chance. Your own flies off before you can blink, soaring in a grand arc toward a goat pen, followed closely by two others, and what looks like half a saddle blanket. Children shriek. Adults curse gently. Someone yells for the tea. Within minutes, the sky goes from gold to bruised violet. Clouds churn like they've just remembered how. The first clap of thunder lands low and heavy in your chest. But there's no panic, no screaming. This is not a disaster. It's steppe weather, unpredictable, inconvenient, and somehow woven into daily life, like wool into felt. You follow the crowd toward the main gyre, where flaps are thrown wide and people duck inside with hurried grace. Hats are retrieved mid-run or abandoned to fate. One old man calmly carries three cradled like sleeping cats. Inside the space fills fast bodies, pressed close, voices rising. Someone lights a small fire. A dog sneaks in, completely unapologetic. And from behind the curtain that separates the sleeping quarters, a woman calls out, "Boil more tea." The gods are bored again. Then comes the hat circle. It's spontaneous. No one announces it. It just happens. People begin passing around hats, some soaked, some crumpled, some clearly not their own. Someone tries on a riding cap and declares it cursed. Another dons a pointed ceremonial hat and immediately begins chanting nonsense, prompting a round of exaggerated gasps. Even the children get in on it. One slips a baby goat into an oversized felt crown, and for several glorious minutes, it becomes a prince. You end up with a wide-brimmed herder's hat, several sizes too big. It smells of onions and smoke, and something faintly citrus. You don't ask, you just wear it. As laughter builds, and the hail begins to drum gently, against the tent's outer layer, stories emerge. Not just any stories, hat stories. A woman with silver-threaded braids tells how her late husband's hat once rolled into a frozen lake and was fished out 3 weeks later by a stranger who wore it for 10 years before returning it, faded but full of dreams. A young man, cheeks still flushed from chasing a goat, swears that his uncle's hunting hat could predict rain. If it leaned left in the morning rain by sundown, he says. If it stayed straight, dry day. If it vanished, thunder. Where is it now, someone asks. He shrugs. It vanished. Laughter. Another tale begins, this one about a wedding feast interrupted by a dust storm so fierce it stripped every hat off every head. The guests, refusing to proceed hatless, postponed the vows for 3 full days. When the wind finally died, the hats were found piled perfectly behind a rock, untouched. They called it the Hat Agreement. Historians still argue whether this story has any factual basis, or is simply a parable about patience and proper accessories. But no one here seems to care about documentation. What matters is the moment and the way these storm-bound stories stitch strangers together like seams in shared felt. You glance around. A woman has tied 2 hats together and made a pillow. Someone else is mending a tear with a sliver of copper wire. The air smells of damp wool and cumin, and rain just beginning to whisper through the grass. Your borrowed hat has drooped dramatically to one side. You leave it that way. No one notices, or rather no one minds. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm sighs and softens. The hail slows to drizzle. The thunder retreats like a grumbling uncle. Light creeps back through the smoke hole above your head, gold once again. But no one rushes to leave, because the tea is still hot. The stories haven't quite finished. And the hats scattered, shared, reworn, reshaped, have become temporary passports. Not to status or tribe, but to belonging. Before you step outside again, you return your borrowed hat to its owner. He inspects it, sniffs it oddly, then nods with a satisfied grunt. You wear it like it argued with you, he says. Did I win, you ask? He smirks. Maybe. But it's still talking behind your back. Later, as the evening sun dries the last of the puddles and the camp slowly reassembles itself, you retrieve your own hat. It's damp, a little gritty, and now sports a new wave at the brim. You don't fix it, because out here perfection doesn't prove anything. But a weathered hat. That's the mark of someone who stayed, who listened, who laughed through hail and tea spills and stories that may or may not be true. You place it back on your head, adjusted just so, and find that it fits better than ever. And tomorrow you'll visit a hat maker. A woman who weaves not just felt and thread, but secrets and charms hidden in the crown and lining of every head she clothes. The path to the hat maker's gear is narrow and winding like a thought that hasn't quite made up its mind. Tall grasses brush your shins as you walk their feathery tips, dusting your boots with pollen and faint perfume. The further you go from the main camp, the quieter it gets, just the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the distant clink of something metal catching the sun. You can't quite tell if it's a bell or a charm. She prefers it this way, your host says beside you, stepping carefully over a flat stone. Says hats speak louder when the mouths are quiet. You nod, unsure if you're meant to laugh. The hatmaker's home sits nestled in a crescent of willow and sagebrush, small and round like the others, but somehow more intentional. Every line of canvas is tight, every knot of rope crisp. Outside, loops of dyed horsehair hang drying on a line, each one carefully spaced like strange musical notes, waiting to be played by the breeze. Nearby, a set of flat stones has been arranged in a spiral pattern, surrounding a shallow dish of water, with petals floating on top. And above the doorframe, there it is a small wooden charm carved in the shape of an eye. Not menacing, not mystical, just watching. She weaves protection, your host murmurs, then glances sideways. And she knows when people lie, so don't. You laugh softly, then stop realizing he didn't. You duck through the door. Inside, it is dim and soft. The light filters through layers of wool felt dyed a warm ochre, casting everything in an amber glow. The scent of lanolin and dried mint hangs in the air, along with something faintly smoky, faintly floral. A smell like summer fire and damp wool folded together with care. She's sitting in the center of it all, cross-legged, barely moving. Her hands are busy, though, threading, folding, knotting. A circle of thick, half-shaped felt rests in her lap, and in the flickering light, the needle glints with each pass. She doesn't look up. You brought dust, she says calmly. You glance down at your boots, suddenly self-conscious. No shame in that, she continues, her voice quiet, but firm. Dust is just memory that hasn't settled. You nod. She gestures to a low stool without looking. You sit. All around the circular wall, hats hang on carved pegs, maybe 30 in total. Some are large, fur-lined with heavy brims that look wind-tested. Others are delicate things stitched with silver thread or painted in thin, faded symbols. One is shaped like a fish, complete with soft felt fins that wiggle slightly in the breeze. Another is so small it could only have fit a baby, or maybe a doll. These are yours, you ask. She shakes her head slowly. No, they're waiting. Waiting for the right heads. You don't speak for a moment. Outside, the wind rattles the canvas gently. Inside, the thread continues its rhythm through wool, around hair pulled tight, tied off. You begin to feel the space around you settle, like your thoughts have been seated too. She sets the circle of felt aside and looks at you fully for the first time. Your head, she says, narrowing her eyes slightly. It's full of echo. You blink. Not a bad thing, she adds. Echo means there's room. You try to think of something clever to say, settle for a nod. Then she reaches for a pouch, a soft leather thing no bigger than a hand. When she opens it, you expect needles, maybe thimbles. But what she removes are fragments. A pebble small and smooth, the color of bone, a sprig of sage, a coil of red thread, a sliver of what might be horn or driftwood, a feather no longer than your thumb, shimmering with iridescent green. What's all that for, you ask? She doesn't answer directly, just begins placing them one by one into the lining of the hat she's been sewing. Each is stitched into place with a kind of reverence, and each stitch is so fine you'd never know anything was hidden inside at all. Every hat, she says, finally needs a heart, a memory, something to hold it up even when the wind forgets to. You ask if that's a tradition or her own invention. She gives you a look that says, "What's the difference?" Later, she speaks of charms sewn into hats, not as decoration, but as quiet protection for health, for safe travel, for clarity, for dreams that don't bite. She tells you about a hunter whose hat always stayed dry even in the worst rain, about a young woman whose hat brim turned yellow after her fiancé was lost in the mountains without her ever knowing. There's knowing, the hat maker says, and there's wearing the knowing. Hats are for the second one. You glance at your own red-stitched goat hair hat hanging on the peg across the room. It looks different here, almost bashful. You wonder what's hiding in its lining. Maybe just dust, maybe more. She continues sewing. You watch in silence as the crown of the new hat forms beneath her hands. Rounded but firm, its shape both soft and authoritative. She selects a pale green thread for the rim and a small twist of copper wire for the inner hem. You don't ask why, you don't need to. When she finishes, she holds it out to you. It's light but not flimsy. Simple but not plain. It smells faintly of sage and wood smoke, like it's already been somewhere meaningful. Try it, she says. You do. It fits perfectly. She studies your face, then nods. That one won't shout. You smile. Can I keep it? She snorts softly. Let it listen first. As you leave, she hands you a bundle of dried sage wrapped in a square of yellow cloth. When you clean your hat, she says, "Burn this." It reminds the thread where it's been. Outside, the world feels a little brighter. Not louder, just more vivid. The colors sharper, the air smoother. You walk slowly back toward the camp, your own hat back on your head, the new one bundled gently in your arms. Your host meets you partway, nodding once when he sees the sage. She gave you thread memory, he says. Means she liked you. That night, lying in the dim quiet of your ger, you think about all the things that can live inside a hat. Not just the head it holds, but the moments sewn invisibly between stitches. The fears, the wishes, the protections you didn't even know you needed. And you wonder who made your first hat, who folded that lining, who chose that color. Did they slip something inside? A charm, a secret, a blessing you've carried this whole time. And if you could open the crown and peer inside, what would you find tomorrow, perhaps? You'll hear about the ones who tried, about haunted hats, about brims that whispered in dreams, about a child's cap that turned up years after he disappeared, still warm. But that's a twilight story. For now, your hat rests beside you, silent but not empty. And you fall asleep, wondering what it remembers. The next evening arrives with an odd stillness. Not the usual kind, the peaceful hush of animals bedding down, or children slipping into sleep, but a quieter quiet, as if the very air is listening. People speak in softer voices. Fires are lit a little earlier. And when you pass a small knot of elders gathered near the central ger, you hear the word Sun's spirit, spoken more than once. It's storytelling night. Not the casual tales told over chores or shared bread, but the twilight stories, the ones reserved for when the sky turns violet and the wind forgets which direction to blow. These stories aren't told every week, only when the air feels thin. And tonight it does. You follow the others to the gathering circle. A low fire surrounded by blankets, cushions, and people huddled close enough to feel breath. No instruments, no drums. Just the flicker of flame light and the quiet anticipation of old truths wrapped in stranger cloth. The first story comes from the plum-hatted elder, of course. She begins without warning. When I was a girl, she says my uncle had a hat that would not stay hung. You blink. Simple enough. He'd peg it always facing east, always with respect. But by morning, it would be on the floor. Always the same spot. Always crown down. She pauses, takes a sip of tea. He thought it was the wind. So one night he watched. Sat up with a knife in his lap and his old dog beside him. He waited. Someone leans in closer. The hat waited too. Until just before dawn. Then it fell. But not down. Out, like it jumped. You laugh nervously. She doesn't. He never wore it again, she says, but he never got rid of it either. Buried it in a dry riverbed. Said it had heard something he wasn't meant to. No one speaks. Then a younger herder picks up the thread. My cousin had a dream hat, he says. Just a soft cap made from sheep's wool. Nothing special. Except he started dreaming. Things. Places he'd never been. Voices that weren't his. Every night vivid. Exact. Disturbing. He pauses, tracing circles in the dust with his boot. One night he dreamed of a stone circle near a black river. The next day he found it. Just like in the dream. No map, no trail, just the hat, leading him. What did he find there? Someone whispers. He shrugs, won't say. He burned the hat after. Wouldn't sleep with one for 5 years. Your host catches your eye. He hasn't spoken yet. But when the fire crackles and someone tosses in a sprig of sage, he clears his throat. I knew a woman, he says, hat maker. Older than time, said some hats were spirit traps. That gets everyone's attention. She told me she once caught a nightmare in a crown seam. Sewed it in with thread made from her own hair, then buried the hat upside down in a marmot hole. You want to ask why a marmot hole, but decide against it. She said that if someone ever wore it again, he continues, they wouldn't dream they'd remember someone else's, as if they'd stolen them, lived them. Is that true, you ask? He doesn't answer. You look around the circle. Every hat present is now offset gently beside its owner brim, up nothing touching the ground. No one is laughing. You think of your own hat hanging on its peg. You wonder what it remembers, what it carries that even you don't know. Then a girl speaks. I had a hat that moved, she says simply. She's maybe 12, her voice calm. Everyone turns to her. It was my brother's first, she adds. After he went away, I kept it, hung it on my wall. But some mornings it was somewhere else, on my pillow, by the door, once in my boots. She looks into the fire. Her voice gets quieter. The last time it was waiting by the stream where he drowned. Dry, silence settles like a second blanket. You glance up at the stars, brighter now like they've crept closer. The final story comes from the hat maker herself. You hadn't seen her arrive. She sits near the edge of the circle, cross-legged, her hands resting on her lap. She doesn't speak loudly, but somehow everyone hears. There is a hat, she says, that no one owns. She doesn't blink. It appears when the weather turns suddenly. When someone is lost in snow or fog, always just ahead, always just visible. The kind of hat you think belongs to a friend walking ahead. A few heads nod. No one interrupts. People follow it, she continues. They don't mean to, but they do. It leads them out of storms, back to camp, to shelter. You feel your skin rise like a field of goosebumps. But no one ever sees the wearer, she says, and no one can keep it. Try to touch it, it's gone. Try to follow it twice, it doesn't appear again. Have you seen it? Someone asks. She looks into the fire. Once. And I followed it, she says. And I'm here. That night you sleep lightly. Your hat hangs beside your bed, quiet, but somehow present. You dream not vividly, not strangely, but warmly. A circle of felt, a braid of horsehair, a voice that says only, remember who you are, even with the wind. And tomorrow you'll take part in a quiet tradition, your final one. You'll hang your hat high as a sign of respect, farewell, and of having belonged. Morning arrives softly. There's no wind today, no galloping hooves, no clatter of wooden bowls or distant bleating goats. Just the hush that comes before goodbye, the kind that settles over a camp like mist, subtle and silver-edged. You stretch under your blanket half awake, savoring the warmth, the stillness, the sense that the world is holding its breath just long enough for you to notice. Today is your last day on the steppe. The thought doesn't land all at once. It comes gradually, like the creeping of light across canvas walls. You move slowly, letting your body remember the rhythm of the past days. The way you've learned to stand in your boots before the second cup of tea. The way you nod instead of wave. The way you reach now without thinking toward your hat. It waits on its peg, tilted just a little to the left, as if offering a final bow. You lift it with both hands. It's gathered a few new creases since your arrival. A faint sun line across the brim, and a patch where last night's smoke left a warm, woody scent. You brush it off lightly and run your thumb along the inner seam. Still quiet, still yours. But maybe not for long. Outside, the camp is stirring in slow ripples. A few tents are being struck in the distance, canvas-folded poles, stacked like ribs. Riders are tightening girths. A woman shakes out a woolen cloak. A child chases a dog who's stolen a mitten. It's not chaos, just motion. The kind that says, we're preparing to move on. Your host greets you with tea and a nod. No long words, no ceremony. Just the warmth of someone who's shared soup, silence, and wind with you. He hands you a flat cake of barley and sits beside you without speaking for a while. Then he gestures toward the center of camp, toward a single post outside the main gear. It stands taller than the others, carved with weather-worn symbols whose edges have blurred over time. You've passed it many times, never touched it. At its peak, a single smoothed wooden peg. You know what it is now, the farewell peg. Tradition holds that when someone departs the camp, whether for a week, a season, or a final journey, they may hang their hat briefly upon that peg, not to abandon it, but to leave behind a trace of themselves, a memory. A whisper of presence, a wordless nod that says, I was here. I was part of this. It is not done lightly. Some say the gesture ensures you're always welcome to return. Others say it lets your spirit linger gently. A few believe that a camp with too many farewell hats becomes wiser, more attuned to the moods of wind and wool and fire. You rise with care, hat in hand. You take slow steps toward the peg. And though no one calls out or gathers formally, a few heads turn, not out of curiosity, out of recognition, out of respect. At the peg you pause. The sun is just beginning to rise, brushing the steppe in strokes of pale gold. Its light catches the edge of your hat's brim, making the red stitch along its border glow faintly, like embers remembered from a good fire. You lift the hat high, then lower it deliberately, reverently onto the peg. It fits. It settles, and for a moment, it feels like it sighs. You step back. You half expect the wind to stir right then, to carry your scent or your memory across the grass. But even the air is still, as if allowing space for something sacred to settle. Your host appears beside you, places a hand on your shoulder. No one leaves empty, he says, and he's right. Because in your satchel, folded gently between spare socks, pressed herbs, and the last of your dried apricots, is the new hat the hat maker gave you yesterday. Modest, quiet, green-threaded, still learning your shape, still listening. You haven't worn it yet, not properly, but soon. Because even though you're departing, you're not just going. You're becoming invisible to others, maybe, but not to yourself. You're becoming someone shaped by firelight, stories by tea, shared without words by laughter, that comes after a pause, long enough to test friendship. And more than anything else, you carry the dust. Not dirt, dust. Dust in your boots, dust on your shoulders, dust in the seams of your sleeves and the lines around your eyes. Dust that means you moved, that you followed horses and waited out hail, that you ducked when the soup spilled and smiled when the children tagged you with dried dung. Before you leave, a small voice calls out. A child runs toward you, one of the boys from the hat tag game. In his hands is a bundle of dried wildflowers and a long ribbon tied into a careful loop. It's for the hat, he says, holding it up. You take it with both hands, heart caught in your throat. So it doesn't get lonely, he adds a little shyly. You thank him softly, so you don't wake your own emotions, and hang the ribbon gently around the peg. The wind catches it just a little, enough to make it dance. You turn to go. You don't look back. You don't need to. Because the steppe, if it chooses, will remember you. In a turn of wind, in the tilt of a hat, in the way someone steps slightly to the left of a tent post, not knowing why, only that someone else once stood there too. And as your horse carries you away, hooves thudding quietly over springy ground, your new hat warms on your head, slowly, gently, taking shape from the journey ahead, not the one behind. You tip the brim forward, eyes shaded, heart full. And somewhere back at camp, a red-stitched hat sits high on a carved wooden peg, watching, waiting, not forgotten, only resting.